Hello, and welcome back to the More Than Sound Symposium. This is session T3 on sonic ambiances, exploring contemporary themes in sound studies. I'm Shanti Sumartojo, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this session. Just as we start, even as we gather virtually, we're all still in place. And I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands in Melbourne I work and live. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a long history of knowledge made through the experience of living on country, a form of profound, place-based experiential knowing that relates directly to the entanglement of place and sound that this session explores. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement to any First Nations people who may be with us today. So as I said, I'm Shanti Sumartojo. I'm an associate professor of design research at Monash University and also a member of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash. My own research includes work on theories and methods of atmospheres, including sensory ethnographic research methodologies. Jordan, Lacey, and I have worked together over several projects over the years, including when I was an academic at RMIT. And his sonic orientations have really helped me think with sound about my own research interests in atmospheres. And I'll just touch on a couple of these interests and how they relate to the theme of the session today over the next sort of 5 minutes or so. So sound, of course, is fundamental to how most of us make sense of and understand our worlds. We're immersed in it. It permeates and it resonates in our bodies in distinct ways that are quite different from other aspects of our everyday sensoriums, such as light, smell, touch, or proprioception. Indeed, if we think of ourselves as feeling bodies that build knowledge of the world as we move through and inhabit it, then sound is central to how the distinctive, particular, and place-specific aspects of those worlds come to our attention and come to matter. So this, I would think, reflects something of the spirit of Jordan's comments in the introduction this morning about how sound is a route to generate new forms of knowledge. As anthropologist Tim Ingold and many others since him have said, if, as we know as we go, then our knowledge of the world is made with and through the environments we inhabit. And sound is central to that sense and knowledge-making process. One way it does this, I would argue, is through its configuration into distinctive and ongoingly emergent atmospheres. So in my 2019 book with Sarah Pink on atmospheres, we argue that atmospheres are a quality of specific configuration of sensation, temporality, movement, memory, our material and immaterial surroundings and other people, with qualities that affect how places feel and what they mean to people who participate in them. So atmospheres and ambiances, then, are a route to meaning. Put differently, we can think through them. We can think through ambiances and atmospheres to reach new insight. And sound is critical to this. An example of what I mean is going to be, in both the papers that we're going to hear in this session. But if we turn to Phil Samartzis' presentation that I'll introduce in a moment, he uses sound recording and composition to register the dramatic environmental changes that are occurring as we speak in high-altitude, cold climate ecologies that are caused by increasing global temperatures and human activity. Meanwhile, in Jordan's own presentation from 3:30, we're going to learn about his recent work, Sonic Gathering Space, and the role that sound art installations can play in transforming our ideas and experiences of public places. So in both Jordan and Phil's practice, then, there is this work to think with sonic ambiances to gain new perspectives on our worlds, perspectives that entangle the sensorium with the specific places that we're inhabiting and moving through in our lives. And again, just as Jordan signaled in the introduction to the symposium, these ambiances take in and are entangled with other more than human bodies, forces, and things. Indeed, this entanglement when one element cannot be treated as standing separate from any other, is an aspect of sensory experience that atmospheres and ambiances can help us reckon with. So that is a very brief introduction to the two presentations in this session. I don't want to take time away from them, but we will have a chance to pull the arguments together in a broader discussion at the end of the two presentations. So I want to dive right into the content for today by introducing Phil Samartzis and his paper. So Phil is a sound artist and researcher investigating the social and environmental conditions informing remote wilderness regions and their communities. Phil's art practice is based on deep fieldwork, where he deploys complex sound recording technology to capture natural, anthropogenic, and geophysical forces. The recordings are used within various exhibitions, performances, and publication outcomes to demonstrate the transformative effects of sound within a fine art context. Phil is an associate professor with the RMIT School of Art and the artistic director of the Bogong Center for Sound Culture. So Phil, I'll turn it over to you and your presentation.
think we're out. So, hi, everyone. I'm Philip Samartzis. It's a thrill to be here with you at this symposium, More Than Sound. I'd like to acknowledge both Jordan and Shanti for their wonderful acknowledgement of traditional owners, and also Tim's warm introduction at the start of today's session, aligning the really wonderful sound research that's occurring across the DSC with some of his experiences in New York. So that's a wonderful endorsement for the breadth of work that's occurring within our institution, which is great. I'm here to talk about atmospheres and disturbances. It's the work that I've been doing in the Swiss Alps since 2019, and for those who don't necessarily know my practice so well, it's an extension of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years in different parts of the world, mainly with an Australian focus. I've been working with Indigenous communities in the Kimberley and the Pilbara in Western Australia, the Victorian Alps, where the Bogong Centre for Sound Culture is located, and across the Australian Antarctic Territory. All of them with slightly different foci, but essentially what I'm trying to do is record the effects of climate change on these particular locations, and particularly on the communities that live and work in these places. The work that I was doing in Antarctica led me to begin considering other localities in which I could extend the work that I've been doing, more or less in cold climate ecologies, but I guess the recording methodologies that I've been testing and pioneering and so forth within a slightly different environment. So I decided on Switzerland as a logical extension of the work that I was doing in Antarctica, mainly because both those locations are really at the cold face of climate change. That's where climate change is being felt, I think, most acute, and the effects are quite dramatic in that sense. So I'll just be talking to this project that I've been doing in recent times. This PowerPoint presentation I prepared 18 months ago when Jordan first tried to get this symposium underway as a physical I guess, event on campus at RMIT right at the start of the pandemic. And so we've had to wait 18 months for it to actually happen at a time which I hope is one in which the pandemic is close to being concluded. There'll be a great book ending for all of us, I think. I've got the kids at home and we're likely to be bombed by them at any time, so forgive me if they appear on screen. So without further ado, we've got a shot of Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea of Fog to set the tone. That's a photograph of a mural painted in one of the tunnels that kind of extend through the Eiger mountain range. It kind of straddles both Munch and the Eiger, and it's kind of peeling and it's a bit rough, but it kind of sets the tone for this wonderful kind of exploration of the sublime. So Ari, would you like to throw to the next slide, please? So this gives you a sense of the terrain that I was operating within. And so that's more or less the back of the Eiger mountain range. So it's the south side that you see, that glaciated terrain. So it's some of the territory that I was trying to record with sound. It's fairly uncompromising, quite hazardous in places, lots of glaciated parts that are occurring through the mountain range. Next slide, Ari. And this is the HFSJG on the top of the mountain range. It's essentially the high altitude research station at Jungfrau, which I was located at for a month or so, recording the environment. So I was interested in documenting the effects of global warming on this particular high altitude area. The HFSJG is quite an interesting and important research station. It's the highest research station in Europe, and it's the only continuously operating research station at that kind of altitude as well. Their data that they use inform things like the Paris and Kyoto climate agreements. So incredibly important research that they're doing in this particular environment. And one of the reasons I was attracted to working at the HFSJG was to kind of get a deeper understanding of the research that they were doing in terms of the type of science, but also to kind of record, I guess, in and around the station to create a portrait of a place under enormous stress. And so the terrain there, you can see, is pretty much where I was working for the month, up along the mountain range and down the kind of the valley there, which is actually the Great Altesh Glacier. Ari, next slide, please. And so that's a shot of the Great Altesh Glacier, which is one of the reasons why the research station is located there. They've been conducting science on the glacier for decades now, so it's the most analysed and probed piece of ice in Europe, in fact. For those who don't necessarily know it, it's around about 23 kilometres long, about 1.5 kilometres at its widest point, and around about 900 metres deep in terms of the deepest part of its mass. So it's the longest glacier in Europe, and it certainly was going through a form of transformation when I was on location there. I could see in fact, the glacier contracting in front of my very eyes because of the lack of snowfall, the actual unseasonably warm weather that the region was experiencing as well, resulting in a lot of ice and snow melt, or lack of snow and a lot of ice melt. The actual recording I played at the start, in fact, was the sound of the glacier flexing, I guess, in response to the thermal energy of the sun. So the big boom and the associated kind of ice kind of falling off the mountain peaks because of the power of the sound, in fact. And it was quite an amazing thing to experience firsthand. It's like a sonic boom of a jet flying overhead. And the attendant sounds afterwards is of the permafrost melting at the peak of Munk, which is one of the mountains that I was looking at that time. Next slide, Ari. So just a shot. Most people want to know how I go about it. So basically a selfie of me with a couple of omnidirectional microphones recording the wind blowing across the glacier. And in terms of anthropogenic sound, there's a lot of tourist activity in the region as well. So something that I'm equally interested in, when we represent places as unusual and unique as these, we often associate kind of pure natural environmental sound associated with them. However, my experience is that they're highly congested environments filled with a lot of transport sounds, so sounds of helicopters and aircraft, particularly jet aircraft in Switzerland. They have a large military presence in their airspace. So the sound of jet fighters, quite a regular feature of the soundscape. Tourists are a highly visited kind of location for tourism, so the sound of tourists are also quite common. And so there's this interplay, I guess, between what we can kind of argue is the natural environmental sound of the Great Altesh Glacier and the surrounding mountainscapes, and how they kind of, I guess, are in conversation with the human sounds that often emerge within these particular environments as well. I've got a little bit of kind of data on the right-hand side of the slide there regarding the type of conditions I was working in. And by and large, wherever I've been, whether it's Antarctica or Swiss Alps, the weather is always a consideration. It's certainly a challenge, and they certainly determine what can be recorded, when it can be recorded, how long you're in the field for, what's actually occurring in the field based on wind velocity, temperature, and other events surrounding you. Atmospherics become a big part of the experience of the location as well, in terms of Shanti was introducing the ideas beautifully in her introduction. What fog, wind, light, just temperature, how that kind of informs the way one works in the field, and the subject matter you ultimately kind of focus on. Next slide, Ari, please. So just, I guess, some shots of the landscape a little bit closer into some of the wider shots that we started with, to give you a sense of what climate change is doing to the Great Altesh Glacier. So it's much more glaciated environment than it once was. The HFSJG research station is at the head of the glacier, and usually the process of I guess glaciers are fed by snowfall, essentially, and snowfall accumulates at the head of the glacier, and then its mass kind of gradually kind of goes down the valley. And so there's this kind of continual cycle of feeding and movement that occurs within it. But at this time, you could see that there's the glacier is compromised somewhat with all this kind of crevassing that's occurring here. Next slide, please, Ari. And again, atmospheres, the weather and the conditions were never the same from day to day. So they were always challenging, always different, always spectacular, of course. What an amazing site to work in, and a great privilege. So the light, the kind of residual kind of clouds and fog, and the winds, at times the blizzards that one encounters are really a big part of the experience. And I probably should have prefaced the conversation a little bit as to why I've become attracted to environments such as this. It emerges from a post-studio practice in which I felt that my composing or my musical or sonic practice was compromised by working in a controlled studio environment, in which many of us do find ourselves working in, and that I was seeking to I guess develop some kind of methodology that was far more responsive to things outside of my control. So working in these more extreme environments demanded different types of working methodologies whilst in the field. But the main concept or idea, I think, being that I wanted to allow the environment to speak for itself, rather than me to impose my own kind of aesthetic sensibility to a lot of the decision-making that one applies to their material when they're removed from it, such as gathering a bunch of field recordings, then taking it to a studio. And then over a period of time, whether it's weeks, months or years, you start to kind of form a response from that material. So in terms of my own methodology, essentially, I would say 85% of my decisions are made within the environment and the conditions I find myself. The microphones I use, the amount of time I spend, the subject matter that I'm focusing on. And when I do bring them back to the studio, it's really ultimately a process of selecting what I consider to be the best representations of a particular event, action or conditions, and then creating a narrative and some description to get from point A to point B, but very little manipulation, abstraction, or composing in the sense of a lot of arranging and choreography of the sound occurs outside of the field. And that's incredibly important to me, to remain authentic and faithful to the experience I have. So I don't want to represent places in a disingenuous way through my own personal kind of considerations. although they do occur, of course. Next slide, Ari, please. So just a couple of the things that I was recording in the field. So there's the top of Monk, and a lot of the ice there is calving and collapsing, as is the mountain range. And so I got some extraordinary recordings just by putting a couple of omnidirectional microphones on the glacier, and then just recording for several hours. And those particular sounds, those carving sounds I speak of, are seldom. They're rare. They don't happen that often. They happen from time to time. So you do need to have time and a little bit of stamina to kind of sit with the landscape, I guess, sit within the landscape and listen attentively to those elements. But within all that, you get other associated sounds, helicopters flying overhead, tourists kind of wandering past, shouting out and carrying on and all that kind of thing. So there's a mixture of things that emerge from a setup like the one on the left-hand side. And the right-hand side is just a shot of the microphone that I was using. I just kind of put a couple as close to the surface of the glacier as I possibly could to capture the sound of ice granules kind of, I guess, blowing across the Great Altesh Glacier. And Jungfrau Joch, where the HFS JG is located, is a saddle between a number of mountains. And it's also the point where the Biss and the Fawn winds converge, a wind from the north and the wind from the south. So you have this beautiful choreography, this play or dance that occurs between the two winds. One's warm and one's cold, and I'm standing right in the middle of the point in which they meet, and they do some beautiful things to the ice granules on the Great Altesh Glacier, which is very, very unique to this particular location. So whilst we can talk about the big carving sounds, the booming sounds of the Great Altesh Glacier, it's these little fine granules of millions and millions of little granules of ice blowing across the ice sheet there that really caught my ear, and I fell in love with that sound very, very much. Next slide, please, Ari. And so, yes, the science, what happens at the HFSJG. So these are the atmospheric labs. It feels like I stepped into a lab from the 1950s. On one hand, thinking that we're going to see some real high-end scientific instrumentation, which this is, but physically, materially, technologically, it looks like something that I've seen in some sci-fi film from 1956 or something. So it's a beautiful thing and privilege to be with these instruments. These instruments are our future. They're marking, they're registering, they're measuring, they're monitoring, they're informing our future, the debates that are currently raging around what to do about global warming and how to cut carbon emissions and all that kind of thing. They make a beautiful industrial thrum and create a lovely relief to those natural sounds that I was talking about. So another point I probably should have mentioned in the preface is that I'm engaged in a post-studio practice. I'm composing in situ. I also try and under-prepare as much as I can before I go out in the field. Complete opposite to someone like Douglas Quinn, who will read every book on the subject before he goes somewhere, be an authority before he goes there. I actually don't want to know a thing before I go somewhere, so that everything is really unusual, surprising, unanticipated. I'm the dumbest person in the room, therefore I can ask, anything without feeling stupid. And so I like that as a technique, in that I'm an amateur, I'm a hobbyist, I'm here. So what does this machine do? What happens when I put a microphone there? It's a much more intuitive process, I think, that I enjoy. And it allows me just to discover things without having any kind of assumptions made before I get somewhere. as well. It serves me well, I must say. I've never been disappointed by that approach, because it's always a wondrous process, something that's revelatory in doing field work. You come out of it and you're completely transformed, as I did in this case as well. Next slide, please, Ari. Again, some of the machinery, technologies that located there, measuring solar and atmospheric radiation. The HFSJG was originally set up during the Cold War, and the Swiss were trying to figure out how to survive a nuclear winter. So these machines, these technologies, are more or less designed for their own self-preservation, and that has led to wider science and the dissemination of that knowledge across the world, in fact. But it was a self-serving kind of process initially, hence why the HFSJG was set up in the first place. Next slide, please, Ari. I'll just keep an eye on the time, so I don't go over too much. It's a highly constructed environment. So we think of the Swiss Alps as, this natural splendour. Well, I'm assuming here that, many people do, unless you've been there like I have, and then all of a sudden you discover how much it resembles Swiss cheese, in this instance, with tunnels being bored everywhere. So I was just out in the field recording in and around the station, and I come back and there's this truck here, this forklift kind of vehicle, carrying a couple of cartons of dynamite for some blasting that they were planning on doing later on that day. And that's something I don't normally see every day. So much dynamite within 5 or 10 metres from my proximity. So it does create a certain level of anxiety. But it's a highly constructed environment. And so there's technologies embedded all over the place, and access points and transport hubs and things of that nature within the mountain range. It's quite an extraordinary thing to see firsthand, and clearly another great source of sound that complicates our understanding and encounter with a place like the Bernese Alps in this instance. Next slide, please, Ari. Again, just another example of field recording within the internal spaces of the research station, which is spread throughout the tunnel system of the Jungfrau saddle, and at the base of the Eiger mountain range as well. And so just some beautiful opportunities to set microphones in little protected areas from the wind that inevitably blows through this particular environment. I did a number of ambisonic recordings in this instance to capture the kind of immersive and tactile qualities of sound through material kind of environments, so through the materiality of concrete, through these kind of portals into these ice terrains and so forth. But I use a whole range of other different methodologies as well to kind of create a contrast and a different focus for the recordings as well. Next slide, please, Ari. So, yeah, it's just jamming more or less omnidirectional microphones into some of the infrastructure to capture the sound of the wind blowing through metal or ice falling from this balustrade kind of thing here on the left, or accelerometers capturing the stress and fatigue that occurs to metal within really cold conditions. And there were points when the temperature dropped, particularly at night, around about -30, and then with the wind chill much lower than that. Oh, stop. So I think I might be running out of time here. Next slide, Ari. So I was just going to very, very quickly talk to some outcomes. So I've currently got an exhibition in Verbia where you do a 5-kilometre sound walk where you listen to 90 minutes of field recordings I've made in Switzerland and Antarctica whilst walking an alpine route, and upon the route are 15 field huts and billboards with images that I've taken from my field work. And it allows the listener to connect to the wider environment, the alpine environment, in this instance of Verbia, and make connections to the sounds of melting landscapes that they're hearing in their headphones with the immediate environment in which they're encountering through the walk itself. Next slide, please, Ari. I'll just rush through these ones. Next slide. This is a close-up of the panels on the field huts. Next slide, please, Ari. And currently, well, not currently, a little bit like Caleb, unfortunately, I was on part of an exhibition called Sampling the Future that was supposed to open at the NGV Australia on August 27, and that's been delayed because of the current lockdown. So hopefully it'll open sometime soon. So the work that I've produced in Switzerland will be presented at the NGV in collaboration with architect Roland Snooks from the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT. He's created this wonderful speculative forms for us to kind of talk about, I guess, through the work, the impact of cloud computing and the amount of energy that it consumes. And a lot of people, me included, don't really think about the impact of what data storage is doing to the planet, but it's one of the big power consumers in the world, in fact. And so this is a speculative architectural form that we're working with, and I've created a sound composition based on the clouds of Switzerland, so being in the cloud, the physical cloud. And creating a relationship between the architectural form and the real-world sounds of climate change in high-altitude ecologies. Next slide, please, Ari. And this is a prototype that we trialled at the Shenzhen Biennial of Urban Design and Architecture in 2019, just before COVID kind of put the kibosh on everything. Gives you a sense of what the form is looking like. It's a bit of a rough version of it. And we're using 7 transducers embedded in the NGV, so all the surfaces in and around the architectural forms that Roland are creating will be sounding bodies, so the sound will be articulated through the materiality of the installation itself. And I think I'm on the final slide, Ari, if you want to go to the next one. Yes, and thank you, project partners. I better quickly acknowledge that this project received a significant amount of support from different stakeholders, and of course I'm greatly appreciative of that trust and support for my project. I'll just acknowledge the Swiss National Science Foundation. Mine is the first art project that they've ever funded, according to them. And they can see the power of sound as a way of expressing some of these acute problems that we're faced, through global warming. So they're embracing the arts and the humanities to help articulate or express the message of the impact of climate change. So I'm incredibly grateful for them for their trust again in supporting me, and of course all my other friends and benefactors as well. So I better kind of wrap it up there, but clearly happy to answer any questions that you might have afterwards and beyond this presentation as well, of course. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was really fascinating. 18 months in the making and worth the wait. I'm sure everyone will agree. Can I please remind everyone listening to pop your questions into the chat on the YouTube channel, I believe, and we can get those flowing as we come up to the panel after the next presentation. I mean, I've certainly got heaps of questions. I'm really, really fascinated by this work that it strikes me is not only about sound, but it's incredibly visually beautiful as well. And also, Phil, how you came to know other aspects, the so-called weather world of the site where you were through sound. So you talk about sound, but you also talk about ice, wind granules, the glacier itself, the changing weather conditions, how cold it felt. For me, it really shows how entangled sound is with this whole other sensorium that is place-specific and really powerfully experiential. So I want to move on to the second presentation in this panel, none other than the esteemed Jordan Lacey himself, the host of this wonderful More Than Sound Symposium. Jordan is a transdisciplinary artist who specializes in soundscape design and the creation of public sound art installations. He was recently awarded an Australian Research Council DECRA grant titled Translating Ambiance. This project combines biophilic design and ambiance theory to discover new techniques for the creation of sound art installations. Jordan is based in the School of Design at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and he's an associate editor for the Journal of Sonic Studies, which is based in the Netherlands. His upcoming, and I must say, one in many books already and yet to come, his upcoming book is called Urban Roar, a psychophysical approach to the design of effective environments, and that will be released by Bloomsbury in 2022. So we all have that to look forward to. Jordan is going to be talking about his work, Sonic Gathering Space, and the role of sound art installations, what they can do in transforming our ideas and experiences of public places. Take it away, Jordan.
Well, thank you, Shanti, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very thankful. And Philip, thank you for your excellent presentation. I always feel like I've learned something new when I hear you talk, such a well-defined and interesting practice. And it's my great pleasure today to present more or less on the end results of the 3-year ARC grant I have been working on. As Shanti said, it's called Translating Ambience, Restorative Sound Design for Urban Soundscapes. So many of my plans have been thwarted by the pandemic and Melbourne's string of gruelling lockdowns. But through perseverance, I have been able to push through enough fieldwork, prototyping and testing to engage in some rich explorations of the translating ambience theme. So it's my intention to share with you 3 of those outcomes, both direct and tangential, of this research. They include the Sonic Gathering Space installation and the Rockpool Dialogue, which is the film that you have been watching in between each of the presentations. And I'm also going to refer briefly to a performative field recording I created called Performative Exploration of 2 Pylons. Before I get there, I'd like to spend some time unpacking the title of my research project, which encapsulates various strands of theory. And just to remind you again, the title is Translating Ambience, Restorative Sound Design for Urban Soundscapes. So first and foremost, my research began as an acoustic ecology project nested in the research culture of Saal Sound Studios, directed by Lawrence Harvey, who we heard from our first presenter today here at RMIT University. During my PhD research, I had become interested in the concept, both theoretical and practical, of sites of respite. These are thought of as sites of rest and relaxation in which to escape the unrelenting presence of undesirable noises. In fact, the desire for such spaces resulted from a project Saal Sound Studios completed with the City of Melbourne in their survey of the public's responses to urban noises. It was found that the existence of sites of respite would be a most welcome urban design phenomenon. And I believe the date of this research is about 2010 to 2012. Forgive me, Lawrence, if I have the wrong year there. It is this ball, if you'll forgive me a sporting metaphor, that I was invited to pick up and run with in the pursuit of a PhD, a process which is captured in my book, Sonic Rupture, a practice-led approach to urban soundscape design, published in 2016 by Bloomsbury. The award of the Australian Research Council DECRA grant allowed me to take my research in a whole new direction. It is concerned with the potential of sound artists engaged in phonographic practices to translate the ambiances of nature into urban spaces. Before I discuss this, I'll briefly comment on those complex, albeit essential, conversations about nature and the urban. From a philosophical perspective, any division between the two appears superficial if we consider that the whole of the material world is entangled and in an ongoing process of becoming. If we follow this type of process or affective philosophy, as I do, the division between the two appears arbitrary. There are also the practical problems such a division exhibits. For instance, the whole of what we call nature here in Australia has been carefully managed by Aboriginal land practices over millennia. The land was erroneously considered terra nullius, that is uninhabited by humans, by the European invaders, and yet the country only ever looked the way it did to Europeans when they arrived because of the fire stick farming and other practices that Aboriginal peoples had carried out across the continent for many millennia. At the same time, things that we recognise as nature are ever ready to sprout and reclaim the concreted lands of our cities, whether that be falcons nesting on the top of skyscrapers, creative surges of humans, weeds breaking through cracks in the ground, or the inundations of floodwaters, etc., etc. In fact, the nature-urban division seems to rest on the idea that nature is relegated to those protected places, national parks and the like, to which we go to rest, relax and restore whenever we have a chance to escape the relentless pressures of city life. Having said this, I do personally believe that there is something different to be found in what we call nature. In fact, my research question is built largely on this idea. In short, is it possible to create nature-based experiences or some derivative of them in the city? When I arrive at a natural place with few humans and primarily populated by non-human life and material assemblages that seem partly or fully autonomous from human endeavour, I cannot question the fact that there is a sense of otherness that engages me. Nature presents the possibility for humans to connect with something other than that of their own making, a chance to look away from the mirrors of our own creation and entangle with something more mysterious, something unknown, something that is more than human. I'm now going to interject into my own presentation with one of my minor projects, one of the two minor projects I'm going to discuss, as a means to illustrate this reflection. One of the sites which I explored for the creation of the sonic gathering space, which I'll discuss soon, is called Terek Terek. It is a rare site of remnant grassland in the centre of the Australian state of Victoria. It is a traditional meeting ground of the Barappa Barappa and the Wemba Wamba people. It is a place presently under native title claim by the Wemba Wamba Barappa Barappa Working Group, whose traditional owner interests are represented by First Nations legal and research services. I spoke to Uncle Daniel Kelly and Auntie Hazel Atkinson by phone about my trip. I told them I went there to explore and record the grasslands. I decided to invite experimental filmmaker Dirk de Bruin, who is pictured there, and conceptual artist Michael Grave, a colleague of mine at RMIT from the School of Art. I invited them as I know they both engage with sound in their own practices, and I thought that through a collaboration there might be an opportunity to explore more than just field recordings. The result is the film Rock Pool Dialogue, being launched here today. The soundtrack for Rock Pool Dialogue is a field recording from Terek Terek, which is also included in the sonic gathering space. The rock pool pictured here is a registered place of significance in the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Register, though I never found out why, and perhaps it is not my business to know. But this place of water and its abundant life in the middle of this dry country felt magical to us, was something that was much more than we could understand. I know you've all been watching this already, but I'd like you to indulge us a little bit more, as I'd like to play an excerpt from the film, which includes its stereo rendering of the Dawn Chorus. And after this, I asked Dirk to make a short statement about his own sonic approach in the making of the film, which will follow immediately afterwards.
Hello. Thank you for watching that collaborative work. The history of my abstracted practice has always been sonically based, referred to as visual music and animation. My first flicker film in 1976 was motored by Steve Reich's drumming, and the next by a Buddhist chant. Jordan Lacey invited me to TERX to see what I could extract visually out of that space. Moving into that landscape, I was aware of the wind movement, the rustling of leaves, the bird calls, and I filmed in a rhythm capturing the shadows, the movement of the sun, and the absences that I felt in my body as I record the images, often frame by frame. The sound was telling me what to do. I took delight in the wind in a uniquely Australian space. I wanted the movement of the images to be in chorus to this immersive space. I could watch Jordan and Michael doing the same, wandering around, and I would record them moving through this space. That's it.
Thank you, Dirk. I first came across Dirk's films as a teenager, and even then I could hear them as they were flickering away. A real pleasure to work with him. As mentioned, the full 30-minute film is being gently launched as part of the symposium and can be watched in full on the YouTube channel at any time. Returning to the main research project, its original premise began with my discovery of Edward O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis. Biophilia at its core is about loving connection, defined as the innate love of humans for life and lifelike processes. This was initially buried in scientific positivism, a genetics proposal, to be precise, that was never substantiated. Consequently, it disappeared for some time, but has since re-emerged into a wide-reaching urban design phenomenon called biophilic design. In its simplest manifestation, biophilic design desires the introduction of nature into cities and the development of architectural practices that engage with the patterns and textures of nature. I remain struck by the synonymous objectives of biophilia and acoustic ecology, both of which want to introduce nature into the city to create improved living conditions for humans and non-humans alike. The most famous acoustic ecologist, composer R. Murray Schafer, who sadly recently passed, argued for something similar. In his book Soundscape, he argued for the design of urban soundscapes that express as much as possible the well-balanced soundscapes of nature. He proposed a new profession of acoustic design through which noisy city spaces would be transformed into delightful, restful listening experiences. This he called the soniferous garden. The approach resulting from the combination of these two environmental design phenomena I simply call biophilic sound design. And it is the translation of ambiances which is the method for practicing biophilic sound design. And ambiances are those in-between places of sound, light and smell that fill what we once thought of as empty space, an insight that can be traced back to Marshall McLuhan and Edmund Carpenter's 1952 paper, Acoustic Space. Most notably, sonic ambience theory and practice has been developed at the Cresson Research Centre in Grenoble University. Ambiances are the mediums in which our body is immersed. They create for us our impression of the world. Presumably, not what the world actually is, whatever that might be, but what it becomes as our bodies perceive the ever-shifting mediums in which we are immersed and entangled. Jean-Paul Thibault puts it succinctly when he writes, ambiances places the sensorial world at the very centre of living space and constitutes a condition of possibility. A possibility that is always in flux depending on what the senses are absorbing in any given moment. As method, I am interested in how sonic ambiances are perceived through the attuned and sensitive listening experiences of sound artists and how their technological decisions are shaped by these experiences, as we just so elegantly heard from Philip Samartzis, his own approach to this. Photographers make specific decisions about framing and lighting and the time of day, etc., before they render an image of the world. Phonographers are no different. Their decisions render a soundscape via their experience into a specific media form. This is the translation. A biophilic sound designer, such as myself, translates an ambience for a very particular reason. to bring experiences of nature into the city so as to present those sensorial experiences to others in the context of an urban design intervention. This is to fulfil the most basic of urban design ambitions, to create restorative public spaces in cities. This is a premise I tested with a group of artists in 2019, the documentation of which is pictured here, and the ethnography results of which will be published with my upcoming book for Bloomsbury, Urban Raw. I'd now like to turn to the core practical outcome of this research project, the Sonic Gathering Space, which in many ways is the next iteration of research following the exhibition pictured here, and which tries to put some of the discovered ideas into practice in a public space. It had been my desire to launch the Sonic Gathering Space at this symposium, as Professor Tim Marshall mentioned earlier today, at a time when we thought meeting in person might be possible, or even that the work could be finalised. But unfortunately, the severity of the lockdown has made such things impossible. The work is due to be installed in the next week or two, I'm happy to say, and I'll have documentation of that on my website for those interested. The best I can do today is to show you this in-progress image that I received from the fabricators just 2 days ago. For now, I am mainly going to focus on the process of the making. The Sonic Gathering Space, this prefabrication drawing showing more clearly its circular shape and the four parts that make it up, is a collaboration with landscape architect and visual artist Charles Anderson, who will be joining our panel. The reflections I'll provide on the Sonic Gathering Space come from my own perspective. What I have to say may or may not be ideas and sentiments shared by Charles, and no doubt we will find that out during the panel. Simply put, the Sonic Gathering Space is a circular park bench, 6.5 metres in diameter, that houses 4 speakers and 8 planter boxes. The circular structure comprises 4 quarters that connect to form a whole, and each quarter holds 2 planter boxes with plantings from one of the 4 national parks. The seating is 1 metre deep and at a standard 600mm height. It is made of galvanised steel and modwood, which is a recycled plastic. Underneath is secured an environmentally protected electrical box with an audio system that drives 4 environmental speakers, and I thank Oscar for providing me with this image. He's been working away in the background designing this system. The 4 speakers play field recordings I collected from 4 national parks in the Australian state of Victoria. In the first instance, the Sonic Gathering Space is circular for one simple reason. Most of the field recordings I collected are ambisonic recordings. These microphones produce a 3-dimensional recording of space and are designed for the purposes of creating playback conditions that are as close as possible to initial listening experiences. 4 speakers, one of the stands for which you can just see in one of the planter boxes to the bottom right of the image, create a diversity of spatial listening experiences, which I will play for you soon. The effect of creating a circle also reveals other influences. Pauline Oliverius's deep listening being a key influence. When reading Oliverius's book, Deep Listening, A Composer's Sound Practice, some of the exercises include creating a circular arrangement within which a group of people can connect with each other through a deep listening to themselves, to each other, and to the environment. It occurs to me that the Sonic Gathering Space is an invitation to listen deeply. Its circularity allows people to face inwards in a circular arrangement while tuning into the sounds emitted by the 4-speaker array. In fact, I'd thought of calling it the Deep Listening Circle in reference to Oliveros, but during a conversation with David Chesworth, an artist and researcher in RMIT School of Art, he suggested the name Sonic Gathering Space. It evoked, he suggested, a less formal environment where people could gather in a sounding space with or without the expectation of deep listening. I agree with him and the name is stuck, so thank you for that, David, if you're listening. I also began to reflect on the mandala-like shape of the SGS. Mandalas are an important part of Carl Jung's psychological system. Pictured here to the left is an image from Jung's Red Book, which sits next to one of the very early renders of the Sonic Gathering Space. Jung's discovery of the archetypes and his identification of archetypal images, including the mandala, is something I am very interested in and explore in my upcoming book, Urban Raw. In fact, it was while researching for my book that I came to notice this commonality. He states that a mandala is made up of 4 parts, which, according to Jung, is equivalent to the 4 personality types he claims we each possess. And when the 4 are equally active, a mandala forms, which itself is a symbol for the integrated self or wholeness. Lest my comparisons seem too tangential, it is interesting to consider that Pauline Oliverios was very interested in the mandala, which the composer applied as a listening and compositional tool as pictured here. I'm indebted to the deep listening practitioner Sharon Stewart, who introduced me to Software for People, Collected Writings 1963 to 1980, in which Oliverios, amongst other topics, writes about mandala music. Like Jung, Oliverios uses the mandala as an organising principle and meditation focus. The number 4 does not seem to be of specific importance for Oliverios, who used the mandala in many different musical contexts as pictured here. However, Jung's influence on the composer is certainly apparent in various writings. I was struck by the number 4 as an organising principle for the mandala and the fact I had chosen to investigate 4 national parks, images of each, which are pictured here. This I see as a pleasing moment of synchronicity, but let's now turn to a discussion of the 4 national parks. The Otways is a traditional country of the Eastern Maar people on the central south coast of Victoria. The striking feature of this landscape is the wild and dangerous coastline comprised of cliffs and rocky platforms. I placed an ambisonic microphone near the steep crevice of a cliff and nested 2 hydrophones in the rocks along the shoreline. I simultaneously recorded each crashing wave's resonance in the cliff's crevice and the sea waters flowing into the maze of concealed tunnels beneath the fallen rocks along the shoreline. In the recording, the resonance of hard stone and the trickles of water can be heard synchronously. Terik Terik, as I have described, is a meeting ground of the Barappa Barappa and the Wemba Wamba. In this recording, I positioned an ambisonic microphone next to the rock pool at twilight to present a close-up listening encounter of flocks of budgerigars, flies and drinking kangaroos. French Islands, situated in Western Port Bay to the east of Melbourne, are the traditional hunting grounds of the Boonwurrung people. I attached multiple contact microphones to melaleuca trees to hear their inner sounds as they stroked each other in the island's clustering winds. In fact, that should be the picture behind me, but I found out I couldn't have one without a green screen, which we couldn't organise in time, but you can imagine that. But pictured and heard here is a stereo pair of 2 buried hydrophones recording the sounds of, as I understand it, benthic animals. If there's any actual sonic ecologists listening, they may correct me, but that's as far as I could learn about where those sounds originated from, that are buried in the mudflats during the lowest of tides. It is the simultaneous above and below the surface listening. and finally in the Alpine Highlands in the land of the Tungarong, while on a recording masterclass with none other than Philip Samartzis and also Douglas Quinn, I found an underground rivulet weaving through a dense snow gum woodland. I located an ambisonic microphone in the middle of 4 small turbulent pools, and in each pool I placed a hydrophone. These are all 2-channel renderings of 4-channel spatial mixes that will interact with the environmental sounds of the courtyard in which the installation will find itself, as pictured here. The black ring in the top left of the RMIT Alumni Courtyard. We have designed a questionnaire with environmental scientist and soundscape researcher Professor Lex Brown from Griffith University, a process I won't go into here, but simply to say it is an attempt to discover how this intervention makes people feel, if it is welcome or otherwise. If we were in person, I would encourage all of you to go listen and access the QR code with the questionnaire, and I hope that some of you at least will have that chance one day. Throughout this talk, I've referred to more than human encounters, as indeed is one of the themes of this symposium. I consider such encounters to be moments in which we feel connected with an environment in a way that exceeds everyday experience. The Cresson Research Centre has a sound effect to describe this, Sharawodji. Although such numerous effects can't be designed, one can try to create the conditions for their emergence. To achieve this in the context of the sonic gathering space, I have sought to embed listening experiences that cannot be accessed by the naked human ear, primarily by situating technology at multiple listening points to create a mediated auditory image for the ear, mediated, that is, by technology. I'd like to finish my talk by reflecting on my second minor project, and I apologise, Shanti, I realise I'm running a little over time here. It's a different type of exploration of the more than human. While recording the extraordinary popping beach on French Island, as I came to call it, and as you heard earlier, I noted the lonely pylons of a long abandoned jetty. One could feel their history draining away as they were slowly reclaimed by the ocean and the surrounding salt bushes. I had the idea of burying my contact microphones deep into the eroded structures of the wood pylons and recording my interactions with them. Revealing hidden qualities with performative field recordings is something I often like to do, but this time I videoed it, for my own interest really. I was happy with the result, and pleasingly it was accepted into the recent 2021 Second International Conference on Sonorities Research called Borderline Sonorities, along with Kath Clover's work, I might add. It is 9 minutes long with 4 distinct parts, but I'll play just the final moments. I stretch out my arms as I fumble with the pylon surfaces, unaware. I mimic the stretched wings of birds that pass behind me. It represents for me an exploration, an entanglement of body with world that wants to feel its way into something. This is for me a more than human moment in which my own body loses itself amongst the many living and non-living bodies that surround me, with the emerging sounds coming to reveal the vital connections that hold us.
Thank you, Jordan, for those last moments of that really mesmerizing work. I enjoyed your talk so much, and especially hearing how your ideas have sort of crystallized and come together over the years. It's really sort of fascinating, really fascinating work. I wanted to just sort of very briefly touch on work by a sociologist called Jennifer Mason. She wrote a book recently called Affinities that I think is really relevant to this discussion, and especially, Jordan, your discussion of the more than human. And she says about affinities that they're sparks or charges of connection that intensify, enchant, or indeed toxify personal life and the experience of living. They're the revelation or charisma of potent connections that feel kindred in some way. And in that sense, they're fundamentally relational. I think she comes from a sociology perspective, but I think there's a lot in her concept of socio-atmospherics that really connects, especially Jordan, to your work on biophilic design that I think is really fruitful. So we're going to move to the last. We've only got, 12 minutes or so. I'll wait for advice about whether we can go over a little bit or not, because I think there's so much to talk about around this panel. To help us sort of traverse through, probably quite a gallop over these next few moments. I'm really delighted to welcome Associate Professor Charles Anderson to join with the two presenters as a respondent and also as a sort of panelist to discuss this rich and fascinating work. Charles is a landscape architect, an artist, a critical thinker with over 30 years of experience making work, publishing, exhibiting, teaching, and supervising around the world. He's Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at RMIT University, where he's also the coordinator of higher degrees by research in the School of Architecture and Urban Design. Charles's work foregrounding the fertile character of collaborative and interdisciplinary modes of practice engages particularly with climate change and the concomitant socio-political disruptions and ecological crises, and explores human, non-human entanglement in order to reconceptualize and reconfigure formations of terrestrial habitation. I'm really delighted to have Charles with us. Thank you so much for joining us. As people gather their thoughts, pop questions into the YouTube chat that we've got an eye on. I wonder if I could begin by asking Charles, because he collaborated with Jordan on the Sonic Gathering Spaces work, if he could give his perspective on the work, which, of course, comes from a different perspective than a sort of sound-specific perspective, and how you think it engages with Charles with these ideas of the more than human and the sort of biophilic, the promise of biophilic design, I guess.
Well, I'll try and be quick because I know we've got short on time. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jordan for inviting me to be part of this. I feel a bit of an interloper, but there we go. My thoughts about the work that Jordan is making was really that of an invitation to collaborate. I'm very interested in collaboration, as my introduction says. So it's just another opportunity to work with someone, to think with someone about something very particular in this case. And my take on the overall project is actually in its original title is pitched to me. It's a prototyping exercise. So so what Jordan has been showing is really an exercise of sort of proof of concept, really about testing what is possible to do with a kind of installed bit of audio recording and vegetation to go with that audio recording to see whether it does what Jordan is trying to test, whether it does have some form of biophilic affinity, to use your word, Shanti, to see whether it does, how people respond to it or don't respond to it. So in the spirit of being a prototype, that's really the way I look at it. And I'm not really sure whether it engages with more than human dialogue per se, but it certainly is a way of trying to think through what our relationships are to the more than human, and also what our affinities might be. I think that's a very useful term, and whether it works or not. And for me, the basis of the project is to actually see how it can be made better, and if indeed do we need to do this kind of thing, or would we rather better spend our money on just planting a tree? So.
Great, thanks. I mean, this question of whether it works or not, of course, is directly related to what you want it to do or what you intend it to do in the first place, right? And I guess this is a question that I have for the whole panel, which is about, what the sort of implications of thinking in a more than human framework might be. So you all engage directly with this idea of the more than human in different ways in your different practices. And I'm very curious about what the possibilities of a more than human framework might be for making change, right? Because we're also all concerned with the kinds of futures that we're all facing, especially in the face of climate change. And all of your work speaks in some way, directly or less directly to that big question. So my question for the panel is, what futures do you think open up if we think with the more than human? So, for example, can these perspectives alter our relationships with each other? Can they help us sort of make sense of and make knowledge with the world around us in a different way that has a kind of change-making potential? Yeah, because I think, like, for example, Phil, like you sort of bring this reality of, like we've seen pictures of glaciers receding, but but you bring this kind of quality of the immediacy of water melting in the sort of ice flows that gives it a different kind of charge, right? A different kind of effective potency, I think. So that's my question for each of you. And I wonder, Phil, since I was particularly struck by this in your work around climate change, if I might go to you first with that question. What is the relationship between more than human perspectives and sort of future making possibilities?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Shanti, and the thing that pops into my mind is that I'm more or less creating science fiction with my recordings. I kind of am tracing or documenting a trajectory that's well in process, and inevitably the glacier that I was discussing will be gone in 100 years' time. I think that's probably inevitable. So in some ways, I'm trying to capture this massive natural force of ice in the Alps as it currently stands, with the idea that it's a spectral landscape that's in process of vanishing before our very eyes. And that's my encounter with that space, as much as I have in Antarctica as well. So I'm not trying to be emotional about that, but these recordings are kind of like a starting point for a world that potentially doesn't have a human presence at all. So it's the sound of the earth at a certain kind of point in time, and whether we can do enough to change this trajectory or not, I probably doubt in many respects. And so it's a form of preservation, advocacy, documentation that's going to kind of sit in an archive as this is the way the world was in 2021 for future generations to listen to. And that this becomes something that may not necessarily have been in my mind at all when I started, but certainly the longer I've engaged with these environments and their communities, and in particular, it became very, very heightened for me when the NGV bought one of my Antarctic works for their collection, and everything was about my death, the death of the author. What happens with this work upon your death? And as charming a conversation that is, it just kind of demonstrates to me that they're talking about generations. The listeners or the art audience in 100 years' time or 200 years' time. How do they encounter this work? Which kind of then places it in that kind of longer time frame. Well, in 200 years' time, that glacier's gone, and a lot of Antarctica has been transformed by climate change as well. So that's kind of, I guess, the things that occur to me when you're kind of talking about the more than human. These things that really are at such a scale that they're probably beyond our control now, and that's what attracts me to those environments as well. They can't be controlled, so you have to work with them and be controlled by them in many respects as well.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that thoughtful answer. Jordan, what about you?
Well, I'll to tread very carefully with my answer here, but when I'm working with the Australian environment, I'm always very conscious and aware of the long history of the many Indigenous nations on the continent. And as I read in my opening today with the book Songlines, and as I've read and heard from many Indigenous scholars and thinkers and activists and authors, this idea of there being a spirit of the land or a spirit in the land. And I'm very conscious that as a white European descendant, that's not something I can really understand and is possibly not my business to understand, and yet it's there. And whenever I'm in the environment, I'm somehow entangling with that, even if I'm unaware of what that is. So, as Kath Clover mentioned earlier today, speaking of the Wurundjeri elder that she spoke with, who talked about that also being the case in the urban, of course. So, for me, a more than human encounter or a more than human entanglement is to try to be aware of those relationships, dynamics or forces, even if I'm acting out of a certain ignorance, and through my own intuitive practices or my own intuitive processes to try to somehow bring those relationships into some type of manifestation which I can realise in my work. So for me, more than human in this context means something that's more than me, that I can't really understand, but I know it's there and it somehow informs my relationship and therefore my actions.
It was a very kind of almost seductive notion of ineffability contained within that, I think. Charles, I wonder if you could speak to that question about more than human and possible futures, future making.
Yeah, well, I think I start out from the premise that to some extent the future's already here, in that we are already more than human ourselves. So the whole question is around, notions of being separate from this thing we call nature or the biosphere or whatever you want to call it. Whereas in fact, we're always already entangled. So we're already to some extent thinking with the non-human, because, the air we breathe, the things that we eat, all the things that we depend on to live and to exist are already within us. And we also, we think with them always. So for me, the more than human is a way of or thinking, or getting people's heads around a completely different understanding of our ontological relationship with the planet that we live on, or the cosmos. So it's a way of decentering the human being and taking the human away from its the center of all things, to include every other organism, living or non-living, as you might want to call it. We're already enmeshed in those things. Like our body is, I forget what the percentages are, but we're inhabited by many, billions of non-human organisms that actually make it possible for us to survive and digest food, etc. So my thinking about more than human is really it's a sort of a tool to start people rethinking what our relationships are, what our relational being is. I don't know whether that answers the questions, but yeah. At the heart of it, there's a thing around just what I further thinking around what I call distributive cognition, that we don't think by ourselves. We actually think always in a distributed manner. We think with things. We're not separate from them. So.
Yeah, and I think also sort of building on the themes of the symposium, that we think also, in our bodies, we think as bodies, which include, for many of us, thinking sonically, as well as, thinking with the other sort of senses that our bodies enjoy. There are a couple of questions from the floor that I feel I not only is it my duty, but also my pleasure to put to the panelists. We have one from Phil's presentation that's specific to yours. She asks, she's curious about what you found to be the largest form of slippage between what your between what your ears and your body could pick up and what you were able to pick up and convey with the microphones. Right. I sort of had a similar question about the kind of bodily experience of being in that extreme environment. So she asks, what is the communicative capacity of field recordings, and how can the listener best meet this knowledge?
It's a fascinating question.
Yeah. While you're thinking about that, Jordan, can I also encourage you to think about how you would answer that question? Because you also work with field recordings and have these really, you got your trousers rolled up and your feet in the water, and you also have a kind of a bodily experience of the sites where you work. So, yeah, what's the slippage between the bodily experience and what the microphones actually record?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. One of the things that occurs to me is the amount of clothing required to operate safely within many of the environments that I find myself in. And it's this it creates a barrier between my body and the space in which I inhabit often. And that's often reflected in my ability to withstand the conditions longer than the technology that I'm working with, which isn't ultimately designed for a lot of those more extreme events that I'm trying to document. So there's this kind of dislocation between my body and the kind of extended aperture of the microphones and technologies that I'm using to listen in to the environment. But equipment has great capacity and different emphases that allow you to focus on different subject matter within the environment, as Jordan beautifully demonstrated through his listening examples. The hydrophone can kind of work in a very particular way that is different to an airborne kind of microphone, an air pressure microphone, and accelerometers and contact microphones work in different ways as well. So they give you very heightened experiences of the conditions. The problem with a lot of the environments I work in, and it's not the problem, it's the feature, and the thing that I'm attracted to probably more than anything else is the wind, and particularly the velocity and the temperature. But with special windshields and jammers and things of that nature, you can protect the microphone from the artifacts that occur through the turbulence that is caused by wind hitting the microphone. So there's lots of ways of working. You don't need specialist recording technology often, but I have lost a lot of equipment in the field, blown away, frozen into icicles and a whole range of things. So you kind of got to also be prepared to wear some cost while doing that. But, that's the nature of it. I think there's slippage between what you hear acoustically and what you hear through the microphone, and I'm inevitably listening to the environment through headphones and through the aperture of the microphone in order to discover the nuances in the landscape.
Thank you. Jordan, I wonder if you want to answer that as well, based on your experience of field recordings.
Yes, I will try. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. This term slippage is really nice. I mean, I guess the only way I would put it is that, say, in the example of recording the budgerigars at the rock pool, I simply put an ambisonic microphone there at 5 o'clock and came back at 8 o'clock and picked it up again, and listened to the recording and took out the parts that were most interesting. So for me, my body having nothing to do with that beyond the placement of the microphone, it meant that whatever life occurs there, the sonic expression of that life, you know, I could record. But on the other hand, with the pylon recording at the end, I try to break down that slippage as much as possible by making the microphone activity exactly connected with my bodily expression. So in that sense, the slippage is minimised in terms that there's a synchronous experience occurring, although at the same time it's still mediated by that technology. It hears differently to me. It brings out different qualities of the wood that I could ever produce myself. So I guess there's maybe a bit of a transhuman thing going on there, where the technology is augmenting my bodily abilities.
I mean, you do both also work with, you know, sometimes yourselves and sometimes in collaboration with photography and filmmaking, right? So do you see that, I mean, maybe this gets to part of the slippage question. Do you see that as a kind of integral part of your practice of sound making, right? You're also image making, and sort of, you know, film is also, I mean, especially Jordan, that's a lot of what you showed us. You know, so can we, you know, I mean, obviously, if you're giving a presentation, maybe, you know, photography is sort of something that you come to rely on. But I mean, Phil, your photographs are extremely evocative, and for me, at least, really go hand in hand with the sounds that you create. So do you? Is that always a part of your practice, that image making or sort of filmmaking, photography?
Jordan, do you?
I'll prepare for you to answer. Well, I'll just say one quick thing. I think Ben Byrne put it beautifully in the conclusion of session 1 this morning when he said, "Sound is never alone." So I'll leave it at that.
I guess from my perspective, I've been practicing in sound for over 35 years, and an image can be used to attract an audience in compelling ways, and so it's a strategy to invite people to kind of invest some time into listening, into the oral world, and so it is useful to have some kind of visual correlation to what you're doing, whether it's a still photograph or video. And I'm always inevitably thinking about audiences whenever I'm making work, whenever I'm doing field work. It's always to communicate something. So I'm inevitably thinking about how to represent what I'm doing to an audience that may not necessarily be fully invested or engaging with the thematics that I'm interested in at that time. So it's a big part of what I do, is how do I visually kind of document the process of field recording as much as recording the environment itself.
That's great, thank you. Now I've been given a heads up by the magical elves on the multiple channels we've got running on the symposium that we need to wrap up. There was one more question, but I'm afraid we won't be able to come to that. Thank you ever so much, Phil, Jordan, and Charles, for sharing this wonderful work, for sharing your insights, and you know, talking through some of these questions. There's so much more we could talk about. It's such a rich topic, and it's been a really, really fascinating afternoon for me. Please come back, everyone, and rejoin at 5 o'clock, I believe, for the final session of the More Than Sound Symposium. This will feature Jordan facilitating, and will include international keynotes from Gasha Ozunian from the University of Oxford and Marcel Kobussen from Leiden University. I'm looking forward to that very much myself. Have a cup of tea, a comfort stop, and we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thanks.